Good evening and welcome to Global Eye. As India shuts the door on RCEP for now, we look at the possibility of an India-EU free trade agreement. Today on the show, we get you an exclusive interview with Christian Leffler, Deputy Secretary General of European Union's External Action Service. But first up, we would like to focus on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. India has decided to stay out of the world's largest trade agreement because of the trade deficit with China, lack of clarity on rules of origin, and possibility of an import surge from RCEP partners. Does the decision increase our export competitiveness, and does it bring us out of the manufacturing and consumption slowdown that we are facing currently? Joining me now to take this forward are Richard Rosso, Senior Fellow at Center for Strategic and International Studies, Alyssa Iris, Senior Fellow at Council on Foreign Relations, and Rajiv Biswas, Chief Economist at IHS Markit. Thank you very much for joining us. Alyssa, first to you. There has been a lot of debate on the need to increase exports from India, increase our export competitiveness. Does pulling out of RCEP help us with our export competitiveness at all?
Thanks, Parikshit. I think the idea of increasing India's manufacturing exports has been a consistent policy goal, not only of the Modi government, but of the UPA government before that. So you can say fairly that successive Indian governments have been very focused on exports as an important boost to the Indian economy. That really hasn't gone in the right direction. Now, the question here is, can India take the necessary reform steps to make its own exports more competitive, to make its own manufacturing sector more competitive, and thereby take advantage of opportunities like trade deals? For me, that's the most important question here.
Rajiv, if we can get you in, India cited a couple of issues with the RCEP agreement: lack of clarity on rules of origin, ability of China to erect non-tariff barriers, tighter integration of services trade into the RCEP agreement, something that we were not able to do. Do you think the risks that were there with this RCEP agreement outweighed the benefits for India?
I think the economic benefits for India in the short term are relatively limited because of this very large concern about how reducing tariff barriers will allow a significant flood of imports, particularly from China, where India already has a very large trade deficit. So I think there's legitimate concerns on the Indian side in the short term that this agreement could significantly undermine the manufacturing sector in India. However, when you look from a long-term perspective, India now is not part anymore of this huge new free trade agreement. So in the long term, somehow India needs to make a transition to be able to join this very large trade agreement, because otherwise a lot of investors from around the world won't choose India as their hub for manufacturing, because if they establish elsewhere within the RCEP region, they get access to much better free trade access to market. So the transition to being able to enter RCEP is now the key priority. How can India establish its manufacturing sector to a level where it can join RCEP?
Right. And staying out of RCEP, Richard, how is it for our Act East policy, something that Prime Minister Modi has been speaking about since 2014?
Well, India already has free trade agreements with most of the RCEP members. So if you were to slice and dice and pull out the ones that were not already free trade agreement partners, you've got China, Australia, and New Zealand. India's been trying to separately negotiate free trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand, and those are largely dead in the water now. So again, echoing other guests, it's not terribly surprising that this agreement fell. India looked east and act east with a lot of these trade partners. They've got existing trade agreements. China continues to stick out. And I think a bigger notion, apart from Act East, when you think about major policy objectives of the Modi government, you look at some of the areas based on leaked text and leader statements about what was included in RCEP. When they talked about things like free flow of data, when they talked about national treatment for foreign investors, these are some issues that, while we haven't seen the final text, appear to be headed towards the final text in RCEP. These go against the grain of recent policymaking steps that we've seen from the Modi government. So apart from customs duties and the concerns about the inflow of trade, you've seen areas on data restrictions that India's been looking to adopt. that RCEP would break down. You look at e-commerce rules, you look at national treatment. So there's a lot of areas, I think, that that fly against what Modi government's been doing that I think are more important than Act East issues.
Right. If we speak about FTAs, and this is what Arvind Panagaria, the former vice chairman of Niti Aayog, has also argued, Alyssa, there has been a lot of criticism about previous FTAs. Sources of the Indian government have said that they have not been in our favor. They've not really helped us. Do you think this is really backed by data? And just because we've not been very successful with past FTAs, does it make a case for staying out of the RCEP?
That's an interesting and important question. I think that India went through a big period of signing FTAs and comprehensive economic partnership agreements with a number of different countries throughout much of the 2000s. And some people in India have come to the conclusions that due to trade deficits, these have not benefited India. So there are a number of studies that are underway. The Finance Ministry has commissioned studies to look at a lot of these different trade agreements to assess whether they've been beneficial to India. I don't know what the outcome of all these studies has been, but I think part of the answer here, again, echoing what I said earlier, is to look inward and to try to understand why it is that such a large and important economy is struggling to ensure that its own goods are competitive abroad. India remains extremely competitive on services. So what is the issue with goods? And I think the answers to that are in fact well known. There are a well-known set of reforms that India could further undertake that would make the Indian economy much more competitive in goods. And the answer really lies in taking those steps to bring the Indian manufacturing economy up to a competitive level so people don't feel that India needs to be protected from its own region or from other countries.
Right. Rajiv, to get you in at this point, we still have some time for the RCEP to come into force. I think it would take at least a year. India also has time till February to thrash negotiations out, and it says that they have given indications that we would be ready for backdoor negotiations. Do you think we need to really seize this opportunity over the next 2 to 3 months and see what the best we can? And after that, do you think that if negotiations are still not going in our favor, do you think we should stay out altogether, or should we at least join and see how we can improve things in future?
I think perhaps a good compromise for India, if other members will agree, is to find a transition period. This is what the ASEAN countries did when they set up the ASEAN Free Trade Area, is they allowed a transition period for some of their members to fully reach the overall free trade standards. So if India joins RCEP on a transition period basis, which could be even up to 5 or even longer in terms of number of years, so 5 years or 7 years transition to fully meet the overall tariff standards of the RCEP. This could be a compromise, and that gives time to implement reforms and also puts pressure on the government and industry to meet the standards within a fixed deadline. Because otherwise, if India just doesn't join at all, then there's no time frame for joining. And if they're not part of RCEP, this huge new Asia-Pacific free trade area, I think it will be very negative in the long term for the ability of India to attract investment into manufacturing, because other countries like Indonesia or Vietnam, which are part of the RCEP, would have the advantage, because if you have your hub in those countries, you'll have tariff-free access across the whole of the RCEP region. So I think the RCEP is a bit of a game changer for the Asia-Pacific. The status quo has changed now, so India also needs to find a way to be part of it. And what's encouraging is that other countries actually want India to be part of this, because they recognize that India is the world's second largest emerging market and actually the world's 5th largest economy. So they want it to be part. So it'd be good to find a compromise. And that's why I think a transition period might be the best compromise, if the other countries will agree to that.
All right. And Richard, China has been termed as the elephant in the room when those RCEP negotiations were on. Do you think we have room with the Chinese? We had the Mahabalipuram informal summit as well. I guess most of these issues really boil down to the bilateral relationship with China, especially on the trade deficit front.
You can find a lot of terrific, well-meaning economists that will certainly point out that long-term trade integration is net good, and you can't simply look at imports minus exports to determine your real value of trade for the economy. But that's what leaders do, certainly in India, certainly in the United States, and many other countries right now. With China, it's been, over the last 15 years, a very one-sided trade debate and worsening over time, in China's favor. So I do think that is a principal policy-making determinant of the Modi government since they came in. Having worked with successive governments going all the way back to when Vajpayee first came in on commercial relations, it's been an uneven but definitely forward-leaning process all throughout on India's unilateral liberalization, with some modest trade agreements here and there. But for the most part, direct unilateral liberalization of the trade regime by India. Since Modi came in and concerned about India's overall trade deficit, but specifically with China, you've seen the adoption of new trade barriers, the enactment of higher customs duties, import substitution rules, things like that. It's been a principal driver, and frankly, it's been the principal driver of the current heated contest between the United States and India on trade issues. So China, this trade deficit has been a principal driver of policymaking. I don't see that changing. So unless China removes itself from RCEP, or if there's a 100-year lead-in period, I personally don't think that RCEP is going to be amended in the ways that India wants, to such an extent that India is going to be able to go in. It feels to me like the decision is pretty final. I think the only things that could bring India back in the fold are extremely unlikely to happen.
Right. And my final question to you, Alyssa, do you think it's better we get into RCEP and play the game? If we cannot really check the trade deficit, those import surges from China, it's important to find better markets abroad for our companies? Do you think that is the approach we follow? And the other point is about perception. Be it the EU FTA that we've negotiated since 2007, be it the FTA with Australia, or be it market access issues with the United States, do you think domestic issues are always becoming a compulsion for India whenever it comes to all these trade deals? And we need to have a focused policy going forward.
Well, trade is an area for any country where you see international policies intersecting with domestic priorities. That's absolutely the case for any country, not unique for India. But you mentioned the word perception. I think there is now a growing perception that India is not interested in taking part in larger trade arrangements. And again, that comes back to these fears about the Indian market and Indian producers, and why Indian products need to be protected from abroad. So how can India look for additional markets for its own goods? Well, these end up being negotiations, conversations. And I think you'll find, as has been the case, India was in a 10-year negotiation with the EU on a proposed FTA, and they were not able to reach an agreement on that front because the Indian side, as I understand it, was not willing to make some concessions on products that are important to the Indian economy, like pharmaceuticals. So I think you're going to find that this issue of not wanting to make concessions makes it all the more difficult to actually achieve a real trade negotiation, because it is all about give and take.
It is all about give and take. It's not a one-way street. Rajiv Biswas, Richard Rosso, Alyssa Iris, thank you very much for joining us on The Global Eye. On the other side, we get you an exclusive interview with Deputy Secretary General of the European Union's External Action Service. That's coming up after the break.